Jeremy Scahill in the room with us, one of the smartest people I know.
Tom, I was saying to you before we came on the air, that I don't know of anyone else who's done more to put the current context or the current situation that we're in into historical context. I mean, there's so much dingbattery that's floating around Washington these days, and it's seriously, I don't. It's like people don't study history.
Yes.
Every crisis is new. Everything in war is new. Everything with the Tea Party is new. No, it's not. There's all of this has historical precedent in this country, and we don't study history in any kind of an effective way in this country.
I think it may be an apocryphal quote, but it's usually attributed to Arnold Toynbee, that when the man who remembers the horrors, when the last man who remembers the horrors of the last Great War dies, the next Great War becomes inevitable.
Right.
And it's just
that's pretty profound given what's happening now.
Yeah, it really is. I'm curious. We're talking with Jeremy Scahill. His new book is Dirty Wars: The World is a Battlefield. And I'm curious your thoughts on what's going on in Syria right now. The president is doing this dance. I was talking with Victoria Jones about it in the newscast just before you came on. He has drawn this red line in the sand. If they use nerve gas, then we're gonna go in and take them out. Well, apparently they've used nerve gas, and now he's saying, well, we're not sure, and we're going to think about it for a while. And it's really obvious he doesn't want another Iraq. What are your thoughts on the whole Syria situation?
Well, I mean, I think that the Assad regime is a brutal dictatorship, and it was a brutal dictatorship when the Bush administration was simultaneously calling it part of the axis of evil and using it when extraordinary rendition was convenient.
Yeah.
The U.S. plays both sides of all sorts of issues in the Middle East and other places around the world. I think though that we are seeing in a way Iraq War redux on the chemical weapons issues and others. I'm not saying that it's not true. I'm saying that I think we haven't seen concrete evidence yet that the threat is as serious as it's being presented. It very well could be, and I think it should be confronted. Any nation that is going to actually be using chemical, nuclear, biological weapons should have to face consequences. Should those consequences be military invasion by the United States and a coalition of its allies? I mean, these are oftentimes fool's errands when we go on them. We say that we're intervening for humanitarian purposes, and then we get embroiled in these wars that oftentimes end up making things worse. So I'm concerned about the calls for the U.S. to intervene. In my sort of realm of what I follow, I would look for the U.S. is going to start doing more covert actions inside of Syria. The Nusra
Which apparently
Front,
we're doing.
there already is covert action on the ground. So I guess what I'm saying is I don't think that the Obama administration is going to get overtly involved in a military campaign against Syria anytime soon, the way that we did when we helped to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi with U.S. air support and support for the rebels on the ground. The problem is that the Free Syrian Army and the Nusra Front, all of these different groups are not necessarily on the same side. And some of them are groups that have an affiliation with or affinity for Al-Qaeda.
Right, nor are they on our side.
Right, so I think that's if you talk to people who are monitoring this for U.S. intelligence agencies and the military, they're very concerned about us ending up piping in covert funding or finance arms to people that will then turn out to use it to attack U.S. interests. Right. I don't think we fully understand what happened at Benghazi. This, unfortunately, has become this kind of cuckoo realm of the far right about Benghazi, this idea that there was this massive cover-up. But I don't think there's actually been a thorough investigation of was that blowback? Were there actions that were being conducted that resulted in that consular office being laid to siege? I don't know. But I think we need to look at what's happened in Libya and be very careful about how we respond to Syria, and also not to fall for propaganda that could be put out by other nations that have their own agenda or other forces within the Syrian opposition. So
sure,
I think there's a lot we don't know, and we have to be careful in how we approach it.
Is there some sort of reasonable middle ground? Like, for example, the civilians are taking the brunt of this in Syria, and an awful lot of it's coming from the air. The no-fly zone in Iraq, while Saddam still took tanks up into the north. In fact, a very good friend of mine took 34 bullets to his car right after George Herbert Walker Bush said he was going to kick a little Baghdad butt declared the no-fly zone. And Horst von Heyer was there doing relief work for an organization that I work with in the Kurdistan in that northern region, and he just sent his military up there.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time in the southern no-fly zone in the 90s.
Okay, so but it was effective at least reducing the level of carnage that Saddam was capable of, and might that be a middle ground? Is that like the camel's nose under the tent that's just inevitable? You're going to end up with the whole camel.
I mean, see, the thing is about no-fly zones that, I mean, just to talk about it on a tactical level, the thing about no-fly zones is that it's not just like you set a rule and then say, if your aircraft are there, we're going to take you out. That means putting in your own aircraft to patrol the skies, and it would probably mean a preemptive strike campaign against the air defense capability of Syria. So no-fly zones aren't necessarily like a non-violent approach where the threat is on the table, and if they come at you, you take them out. The U.S. would probably, or it's most likely they would use another country to do it, maybe another NATO country, go in and take out their air defenses. I mean, unfortunately, the Arab League...
Would that be a bad thing?
Well, I mean, I think that's the perspective that's put forward by people like Anne-Marie Slaughter, who now is going to be she's the Princeton professor, former senior official at the State Department. I think we would need a whole hour to discuss this, but I ultimately don't think that no-fly zones work, and I think that the people within them end up paying the price. I think that the intent is noble, but I think that the reality on the ground often is that the civilians who we say we're protecting end up being the ones getting hit.
Isn't there a certain level of kind of hubris and what's the word where a nation is empire, of hubris and empire?
You said the E word.
With this idea that we can solve all the problems of the world, and oh, by the way, we're going to ignore Robert Mugabe because the principal product of Zimbabwe is rutabagas or something. I mean, they don't have any oil, but
Well, somebody said if we had olive oil instead of petrol,
exactly.
Well,
but isn't on the one hand, you could argue we should just let them sort this stuff out themselves. And then on the other hand, you say, well, we could have said that during World War II about, Hitler too. And, there has to be a point at which you say enough.
So, I mean, it's interesting. I remember when I was in Yugoslavia in the 90s during the bombing of Serbia over the issue of Kosovo.
Yeah.
That year, the Turkish government was using hundreds of millions of dollars in U.S. military aid to turn weapons on its own people, on the Kurds of Turkey, and they were waging a genocidal campaign against the Kurds at a time when we went to war against Serbia, supposedly to stop the ethnic cleansing of Albanians in Kosovo. I mean, history is full of examples where the U.S. will intervene when it feels that its interests are at stake, and very seldom intervenes purely if ever, for purely humanitarian means. You know this history better than anyone, too, Tom. The history of World War II. The United States was on the wrong side when fascism was on the rise in Europe. If the U.S. had joined with the anti-fascists, who very early on saw the threat that was being posed, the Franco Rebellion, when Hitler first started posturing against Poland, the U.S. was not on the right side of history at that moment. Yeah. So
you had the entire Republican Party in the United States. I mean, probably the most widely published author in the world at that time was Rex Stout, and he wrote this book called The Illustrious Dunderheads in 1946, which is just a collection of speeches on the floor of the House and Senate by virtually all Republicans, or a few Democrats, saying, oh, Hitler's not such a bad guy. We shouldn't go into the war. FDR wants to go into a war so he can become a dictator. Pardon my interrupting you.
Yeah. No, but I mean, it's sometimes those of us who argue against some of these wars that are portrayed as being humanitarian get World War II thrown in our face.
Yeah.
And I think, I'll take that question on and legitimately and discuss what I think is a legitimate part of that question. And I don't mean that you did this, but oftentimes those people forget that are presenting that challenge, forget that the United States totally ignored or supported, or its corporations or politicians supported the rise of fascism in Europe. And so if you want to just cherry pick and say, well, wasn't the U.S. right to intervene because of the slaughter of millions upon millions of Jewish people by Hitler and others, gay people, Roma people, I mean, the list goes on and on. Yeah. It's such a selective reading of history. And in order to understand should we intervene in Syria or not, let's look at the whole historical context, and let's look at the level of slaughter in Syria relative to regimes around the world that we've been financing, supporting, bolstering. I mean, let's be clear here. The U.S. would intervene in Syria militarily if it believed it was in its geostrategic interests, not just because it's the humanitarian thing to do.
2 years ago, we did our show from the Darfur border in South Sudan. 500 miles.
Now, where is that? Is that somewhere in is that a province in Afghanistan? I mean, it's,
you know where.
No. Of course I do. It's just it's
and
perfect.
And that's the thing. It was 500 miles from the nearest road, 500 miles from the nearest electricity. They had not yet figured out that there was oil there. Now, actually, it was about 4 years ago we did a show. Now the Chinese are crawling all over the country, pulling the oil out and cutting deals.
Remember when Bill Richardson, when he was running for president for the nomination, Democratic Party, he said at one of the debates that we could get the slaughter to stop in Darfur by threatening to cut off raw metal exports to the Chinese government. He said something that was too smart for cable television, but his point was, the U.S. could use its tremendous economic leverage to force China and Russia's hand at various times, and it chooses not to do so.
Particularly with regard to Northern Sudan, with the Bashir government.
Look, I mean, China controls a huge percentage of the Sudanese oil market, and has a lot of leverage with that government. So if we can encourage China to do more, I'm just saying this is all fifth dimensional chess. Military solution should not be the first option on the table, and I don't think the U.S. should intervene in Syria. I do think there are other ways of confronting governments that do these things. But we shouldn't be the cops of the world.
There you go. Jeremy Scahill, Dirty Wars. The world is a battlefield.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Jeremy, thanks so much for being with us.
It was a real honor to be with you, Tom.
The book, Dirty Wars. The world is a battlefield. Jeremy Scahill.